Hey HTDA, and welcome back to my Satisfactory 1.0 Masterclass. In each episode I'll give you one specific goal to work towards, which you should ideally be able to complete in 1 or 2 sittings. Now, just as a warning, here's a sneak peek of what we're actually going to be building, and this is not even all of it. There is a whole bunch more over here, and there's a whole different factory in the corner over there. So don't underestimate that this episode, even though it's like half an hour long, maybe 40 minutes or something along those lines, it's going to take you a little bit longer than most of the previous episodes to build. Just take it step by step, you'll get through it, but we are going to complete phase 3. As before, there will be a link to the entire build of this episode in the description below, so you can follow along with that and you can see exactly how many buildings I'm using and what is being attached to what. So that it should make it a little bit easier to follow along as well. For this episode, I'm actually not going to be using any alternate recipes. I'm just going to do everything 100% standard, so at least that part should not be a problem. And hopefully you will be able to follow along quite nicely as a result. Alright, let's get going with some copper. We have several copper nodes very close by, which is extremely convenient because we're going to be using all of them. Now we're going to need a total of 18 smelters making copper ingots, and that doesn't really work with the current blueprint I have for the iron, although I could just underclock stuff. But I want to make a new blueprint that allows me to make a nice even number, so I am going to make a new blueprint for 6 smelters, so I can make 3 times 6 is 18 in a nice layout. Now, honestly, there's nothing wrong with underclocking. Actually, it's quite efficient if you don't mind the additional space the blueprint takes up. But I wanted to make the other blueprint mostly to show you a different way of building it. So, not my preferred style necessarily, but it is something a lot of other people enjoy, so I did want to show it to you. This is basically a layout that still has the inputs coming from the middle, but then actually loops back the outputs back on top of the machine itself. Now, you can either do that like this, with the mergers going through the middle, or you can just place the actual mergers on top of the machine. Now, if you do this, and I'll show you how that looks in a moment, you will see the smoke kind of coming through the mergers, which I'm not a huge fan of, but it looks kind of cool having the actual mergers on top of the machine at the same time. So again, it's completely up to you which one you prefer best. However, if you are struggling a little bit with getting the mergers and splitters to go where you want them to, you might need to resort to a trick like this, that you place down a couple of these foundations, so you can actually get these mergers to sit at the height and the location that you want them. If you connect them straight to the machine, like I can do over here for a moment, then you will see, assuming I don't drop down, then you can see that it doesn't quite nicely align. So you do actually need to place them manually on top of the machine in order to get them to look quite right. Also, when making new blueprints like this, don't forget that you can actually use blueprints to build blueprints, so you don't have to line up every single smelter by yourself. If you just do it once, you can just copy paste that by using the blueprint function as well, and you have all of them nicely sitting on top of where they need to go. Whatever design you decide to go for, make sure you place down 18 of these smelters, and then we're going to go hook them up to the copper. So remember when I said we have 3 nodes available? These are actually normal nodes, so if we just use them as they are, they're going to be producing 120 ore per minute, and we actually need a total of 600, so with those 3 nodes that's not quite going to cut it. So what we're going to do is we're going to overclock 1 to 200%, giving us 240 per minute to begin with, and then we're going to overclock the other 2 to 150%, so they each give the 180 per minute. That in total makes 600. Now, of course, if you're somewhere else on the planet, you might need to do this differently, but the reason I'm doing it like this is so that I can have the middle belt splitting off the 240 per minute between the 2 outer belts, so they will max up to the maximum amount that you can put on a belt to begin with. And then, as you can see, the middle belt initially will be a little bit slow, but we actually have an overflow on the side belts, so at some point these will get stuck, and then this belt will also kind of regulate itself, and that way we have the easiest way to balance these belts without getting into a whole complex system of mergers and splitters. With the copper ingots in production, it's now time to put them to use, which is why we're going to be building 6 constructors making copper sheets, one of them being overclocked to 50%. We basically need 6.5 constructors, and I want to try to minimize the amount of random constructors, assemblers, etc. if I can. So just by overclocking or underclocking a little bit here and there, we can use the same layout across our entire facility, or mostly at least, so that just makes it look really good without actually changing anything to the efficiency. Now with larger facilities like this, you're usually going to run into the issue that you have some belts being completely utilized and some belts not being completely utilized. That means that you're going to need to get into a habit of splitting off some of your production and then re-merging them later on after you use them in a part of your facility, so you can use the remains later on in your facility as well. Now an easy way, if you're in a large logistics floor like I am over here, to keep track of where you still have basically inputs that you want to use elsewhere is just connecting a temporary splitter or a lift, like this. So this basically tells me, okay, there is some sort of input or output that is going to come from here that I can still use somewhere else that's not completely dedicated to something already. If you put a small belt like this, you can easily tell what's actually coming out there, so it makes it a little easier to keep track. And then basically all the dimensional depots actually signal that there is a certain production coming out at that specific location that I can either split off or that it's already a final product. So for example, over here you can see I'm merging all my inputs, and all I need to do is check, okay, apparently this is where I make my iron rods. And if I want to split off these iron rods, all I need to do is connect a belt like this. And then hopefully, yep, there we go. That's where the output goes. Now remember that the smart splitters are always set for any into the dimensional depot and overflow on the other output, so we first fill up our inventory and then use the remaining products in the factory itself. If you make sure that every single time you have an output you connect a smart splitter to that and then a dimensional depot like this, then you don't have to think about whether or not this is configured correctly, but you can just trust yourself that the first time you set it up you always do it like that, so that you can rely on that moving forward. That might seem like a small thing, but trust me, if you get into the habit of doing that, you will not get into a situation where an hour later you come back to your factory and you find out it's not actually working, just because you forgot to configure a smart splitter or connect a belt or something like that. Okay, so moving on to wire, which we're actually going to need a whole lot of. So this is 24 constructors making wire, and 4 of those constructors are overclocked to 100% because we need the total production of 28 constructors. So by overclocking 4 of those 24, we actually get to the equivalent of 28. Now, I could just build 4 more constructors. We have plenty of room. I mean, that's not a problem. But again, I just want to try to stick to the one blueprint I have as much as possible and make the factory look nice and clean. So this is what I'm doing, and that is why I am doing that. Also, as a side note, I will be using the colors to kind of notify what is being produced where, but because these are all copper products and I all associate those products with the copper orange, or something that looks like that at least, this is why they're all the default color, because that actually works quite well for copper. But as you can see, we have the blue in the back for the iron and some other colors going around as well. Now, honestly, I find myself using just like a handful of different colors, but even doing that makes it a lot easier to kind of identify what you're producing in which part of your factory without having to make a specific color for every single product, because honestly I wouldn't know what color I would need to give to wire and copper sheets. That both makes sense and also makes it easy to distinguish between those two. Look at how organized this looks when you're actually walking through your factory, and again, just make sure you leave yourself some room in between the different units as well. But yeah, this is really very easy to do and still clean looking, just like I promised you from the get-go. Next on our copper list are the cables, which we're actually going to need quite a few of, so we're going to need 10 constructors making cable. But again, I'm trying to be efficient and consistent just to make my own life as easy as possible, because we're going to need to build a lot during this episode. So I'm just again using the 6 constructor blueprint, and that means I have a total of 12 over here with these two units. I only need 10, so I'm just going to underclock several of them in order to get the equivalent production of 10. And actually underclocking saves you power compared to building 10 normal buildings, which is really weird, but it's actually true, so you might as well take advantage of that as well. Now do keep in mind that with some recipes, for example the cable in this case, we have a very high input requirement, and if we have 6 constructors demanding 60 wire per minute, that's going to add up to 360, which is more than the Mark III belt can handle. So in those cases you might need to have a intermediate feed into your supply line like I have over here. So the first 4 of these constructors are being fed through this first belt over here. That adds up to 240 wire per minute demand, so that is something a Mark III belt can easily handle. And then the last two are actually going to be fed by a separate belt coming in, so that I can ensure that these are actually getting the 120 wire in total that they require. Which, once again, I'm just going to repeat this just because it's super important that you understand this. That means that you might need to split as well as recombine some of your belts to make sure that you get the resources where they need to go. Just keep an eye on your machines as well as, of course, the output of your initial blocks. Do a little bit of math and see what amount of resources will be going on each incoming belt, and then again, like I said, just merge and recombine them just to make sure that you make use of all those leftovers that you might have. Okay, so now we actually have all our basics once again covered, ranging from plates to copper to wire, etc. And that means it's time to move on to the slightly more complex stuff. Now, some of that is not new. For example, we are going to need some stators. We are going to need a lot more stators than we were producing before in the other factory. Specifically, we're going to need 6.5 assemblers making stators. Which of course means, because I'm lazy, that we're going to be building 6 of them and then overclocking one to 150%. And the stators kind of nicely align with the copper production over here. So similarly to what we've done over here in the back, where we had the iron production and the kind of west to east aligned assemblers over there, I'm doing the same thing over here, which kind of brings some sort of symmetry to our build as well. Now, you don't need to do this, you can use whatever orientation you want, obviously. But I like kind of switching it up every now and then, so it's not just pure rows of the same thing over and over again. Now, the nice thing about this particular layout is that we have those 6 stator assemblers over here, and we only need 2 motor assemblers over here to kind of finish off this particular production line. Now, the motors are going to be crucial to the unlocking of the next couple of technologies, so make sure you have a dimensional depot attached to that. You should be doing that for pretty much every type of resource you're producing anyway, and I would recommend that you keep doing that as you expand, unless you know for sure that you have more than whatever you need of that particular resource already. There's a couple of examples of that. For example, you don't need that many stators as an example, but for most things it's not there's nothing wrong with just adding a couple of more dimensional depots as you go, because you will need more and more of those resources. Anyway, we have 2 assemblers making motors now. With all of that production up and running, by the way, you will probably now have gotten to the point where you're probably already done with the first all frameworks, like I am as well, and you're producing a whole lot of stuff that is not actually going anywhere because you don't have a output for it, because we are not transporting anything new into the elevator, and we don't have a sink yet. So this is where getting a sink up and running is going to be very profitable if you want some more tickets. So we have this nice open space in the middle. Let's use it. Now, I recommend not connecting every single type of thing you're producing to your sink, but I do recommend getting some of the more high-end products. For example, I have the smart plates, as you can see over here, and the versatile frameworks. Those things are really worth a lot more point than trying to sink all the, let's say, wire that you are overproducing. You can do that if you want, but you will need to add some more sinks to that, and you will also greatly increase the complexity of your logistics underground. Now, just in case if you're wondering, is that actually worth sinking then? The answer is yes, because as you can see, once I start offloading my overproduction of those high tier items, just those high tier items actually hit a total of 157k points per minute. So just in a few minutes I actually got several coupons, even though I already have a lot of them. So it is worth making sure that you get some of those, because, well, who doesn't like new buildables? Now, we're actually going to leave this base for a little while now, and as you can see, it's far from done. I didn't make it look nice or anything like that, because we're first trying to get it up and running, and then we can think about making it look nice. A lot of you asked for a bit of an overview of what I've done so far, so here you go. I hope this is a better bird's eye view than what I've been doing before, because I actually just raised a couple of towers and got up a little bit higher to give you a better view. So we have the entire factory from last episode over here. And then on this side, we have the 18 smelters making the copper in the back. Then we have those 6 constructors making the copper sheets. Then we have a whole bunch, 24 in total, of these constructors making the wire. And then we have another 12 of them making cable. Then we have the 6 assemblers making the stators. And then we have the 2 assemblers making the motors, and that adds a whole section over here to the production that we had going already. And look at that, It looks so nice and clean to have a nice little white. I took that color because it just looks really clean sink in the middle of the base. Now we're actually going to be using some of this space as well, but we're first going to have to do a couple of other things. Specifically, we are going to unlock oil processing and get some oil up and running. And as you can see, we actually need the motors for that. So make sure you pick some of those out of your dimensional depot. Now, this is something that confuses a lot of people because, well, you're going to be unlocking 12 new things. Some of them are shop items, but still, there's quite a few new items. And in general, fluid production is quite complicated, a little bit finicky. So we're going to be spending a little time on explaining how to get that up and running as easy as possible. As a side note, we're doing great on power. We have about 2600 total production up and running at the most, assuming every single machine is turned on, but right now a couple of them are still backed up. So that means that we're getting close-ish, not quite close yet, but we are getting much closer to the production cap of 3600, which is also where oil is going to come into effect because we can actually produce some fuel. Oh, and of course, before I forget, you can actually pick up the jetpack now, which a lot of people really like. I personally actually don't use the jetpack that often because I highly prefer the parachute, which actually has a long gliding range. And the jetpack doesn't really become that effective unless you have higher tiers of fuel. Again, my opinion, but it's worth picking up even just for the inventory slots, of course. Now, if you're playing along with me, what we're going to do is we're going to go to these islands just south of our base, which has quite a few of these crude oil nodes that are of pure quality, as well as one normal, I believe. I think there's actually one more over here that's not showing up, but in other words, there's going to be plenty of oil for us to work with. There's also going to be a lot of creatures around, so make sure you arm yourself or just turn the creatures to passive or reactive if you don't want to deal with all that fighting. Side note, there's also a drop pod location on this bottom left island over here that actually has no requirements, so you can just pick up your free hard drive over here while you're at it. Now again, the reason I really like the Rocket Acid as a starter location is because this oil location is actually in spitting distance almost of our starting base that you can see over here. So I'm actually going to build my fuel factory or my plastic and rubber factory over here on this part of the water that is actually going to be really close to the oil as well, because the oil is right behind us somewhere on the floor over there where the creatures are. And we just need 2 of the pure oil nodes in order to have all the oil we need. Now, just because you're building a very simple transportation line with some pipes doesn't mean it doesn't need to look good. And I really like giving my pipes the color of the liquids that are in them. So you can see, for example, I'm mining some oil over here, and this is going to be the oil pipeline. Now, I do recommend actually leaving the coloring of your pipelines until the end, because otherwise you will need to recolor them every time around when you're rebuilding stuff and you inevitably make some mistakes. But anyway, you have these 2 pipelines, each of those coming from one pure node over here. And that is actually perfect because that allows us to build some refineries over here in the viewing distance of our other base. So what we're going to do is leave a couple of spaces, it's 2 foundations actually in my case, in between those 2 refineries. And we're going to be building a total of 16 of them, so 8 on each side. Now we're going to be dedicating 5 of these refineries to rubber, and then the rest is going to be dedicated to plastic, which means you're going to be producing plastic on one side and then rubber and some plastic on the other side. Now, of course, we still want this to actually look good, and because these buildings are freakishly tall, we're going to be using some larger pillars in order to have the power setup up and running. It's going to be a very same principle as we've been using so far, with this bar on top of that where the power is connected, just to stick with the theme throughout the factory. But making a thin pillar like this sticking up all the way into the air looks a little bit weird, so I think actually using the bigger pillars makes that look good. And you can actually use the pillar foundations as well to make it look even better. Speaking of making things look better, you can also use the floor holes. You should have more than enough tickets to buy them, and they allow you to nicely connect everything up to the floor, so they are not just clipping through, but it looks very intentional instead. The inputs of the factory are very straightforward. In this case, we just have the oil coming in and we can pump that straight up. You might want to connect a couple of pumps just to make sure you can actually reach up high enough. It should be fine without pumps actually, but just making sure you have a pump on your pipeline. Make sure you have an additional head lift so you can make sure the liquid is actually going up where you want it to. Now, do keep in mind that you need to watch what direction you put your pump in, because you can see the flow going if you connect it. that tells you what direction the flow is actually going to go into. If you put it the other way around, things are not going to work. Similarly, with the use of ceiling mounts, you can also make your outputs connect a lot more smoothly as well, and make sure there's no clipping involved if you don't want them to. Now, this is one of my favorite layouts when you connect everything up, because it just looks so professional and smooth looking. So this is the side where we are only producing plastic, so this is pretty straightforward. On the side that you're also going to be producing rubber, make sure that in the back of the line, so as far away from the direction that you are producing as possible, you're producing the rubber. And then the first 5 of those mergers are going to be on the ground floor instead, so you can run the belt underneath and still connect the plastic to their other counterparts. Which could look something like this, with, like I said, one belt on the floor and one belt slightly raised, and that still is very organized, very much not clipping. And on top of that, we should also make sure that we include some of those dimensional depots, because we're going to need plenty of rubber and plastic to unlock everything else. However, it's not quite as simple as that, because you might have noticed that you're actually going to be producing heavy oil residue along with whatever you are trying to produce, whether or not it's plastic or rubber. So we're going to need to deal with that, because we don't want that to back up our production line. So in order to get rid of the heavy oil residue, we can start producing fuel out of that instead. Now, I recommend that you just put up 4 refineries to make fuel. And you can split them off slightly from the 16 that we already have, for a total of 20, but I would keep them apart a little bit so it's clear that this is a separate type of production. And, well, you technically only need 3.5 fuel refineries, but making sure you are getting rid of all the residue that you can is always a good thing. Now, if you like color coding your logistics, this is the time to do so. So I have, for example, the purple pipeline over here with the residue. We have the rubber coming out over here. We have the blue plastic coming out over here. And we have the oil going in. And you can easily see what's going on where by doing this. Of course, it does take a little bit of time to actually get all these colors in place. So it's completely up to you whether or not you want to bother with that. You can also color code your actual refineries to make it even easier to tell what's going on where. And of course, we have the nice little power connections over here to make sure everything is up and running. Now, in order to actually power things, we're going to need to bring in some power lines. And this is where these nice, large, new power lines come in that make it extremely easy to transport your power across long distances. And you can actually nicely integrate them into your buildings as well. As you can see, they fit nicely under the line I have over here. So it almost looks like they're supporting the building. And, well, yeah, all in all, I think this is a pretty good looking factory like this. However, once you turn it on, you will quickly notice that it will turn off again because the fuel has nowhere to go. Which is why at this point you want to unlock petroleum power, which allows you to build a fuel-powered generator. So in fact, we're going to need a total of 7 of these fuel generators in order to actually consume all the fuel that we're currently producing. And we do want it to consume all the fuel we're producing, otherwise the other production will actually back up, and we don't want to manually flush the system. You can do that actually. So if you click on any pipeline and you select full pipe network over here, if you press this button over here, it will drain all the resources from the system. Of course, it will be filling back up again, but that is a nice way to kind of reset your pipeline. Speaking of which, what you typically want to do is make sure that you initially turn off all your generators. You can do that by clicking the standby button over here. Make sure the entire pipeline is filled up and then turn them on from the back to the front. So in my case, the resources are coming in from this fluid buffer over here. And that means I start turning on the one all the way in the back and then work my way in this direction. The reason for that is that fluids in this game are not just going from A to B, they actually kind of slosh around and they react to gravity and things like that. So while your pipes are not completely full, things are kind of going everywhere, and that's not what you want to happen. So if you don't fix that, basically what's going to happen is you will see your fuel generators turn on, turn off, turn on, turn off. At some point that typically does fix itself, but it can take quite a while. So making sure the entire pipeline is full before you start turning things on actually helps to deal with that. And on top of that, actually using some fluid buffers I find helps with that as well. So I'm just putting in all the resources from these 4 generators, refineries into this fluid buffer and then having it pass on, so that there's basically a collection unit over here that kind of helps with making sure that things are not sloshing around. You can also put in a pump in the bottom if you want. Again, everything just to make sure the fluids are actually moving in the direction you want them to. If you want to make that a little easier on yourself, what you can actually do is build the fuel generators on a lower floor than where you're producing the fuel. That just means that gravity is going to help you out with the whole sloshing part. Now you might have noticed the sink over here, and this is also extremely important because whenever the plastic or rubber production backs up, the fuel production will also back up, which is a bad thing because if the fuel production backs up, then the power from these generators is not going to be reliable, and that might cause chaos in our factory. So in order to avoid the fuel turning off, we need to make sure we're sinking the rubber and the plastic, at least stuff we're not using. And in order to make sure that this is being produced, we need to make sure we're actually consuming the fuel. So this is where the whole fuel situation becomes a little bit more complex, and the rubber and plastic as associated with that as well, because you basically need to ensure that this production line is always functioning at 100% if you do not want to get into any trouble. As an optional step at this point, you might also want to unlock fluid packaging so you can actually package up some of that fuel that you're now producing. Packaging is really simple. All you need to do is split off some of your fuel production to the other side, for example. Set up a constructor to make canisters, as you can see over here on this belt. The canisters are being made from plastic, so you have that right available at this location. And then you have a packager where you put in the fuel, you put in the canisters, and packaged fuel comes out. Now you can sink that, of course, or you can put that into a dimensional depot. And that means that you have always infinite fuel on you, so your jetpack will never run out. Alternatively, you can also use this fuel to, for example, power trucks if you would want to use them. However, in this case, I am just going to be building a very large bus, as you can see over here. Mostly because my factory is right over there, so setting up a tractor or whatever you want to transport that resources by is actually going to be more work than just having a couple of belts. Now, just in case you don't agree with me that this looks awesome and you definitely want to use trucks, you should, because honestly it's a lot of fun to do. Maybe not the most efficient thing to do, but it is very much fun. And I actually made a couple of episodes about it in my previous series where I showed you how to kind of have a central depot where all the trucks arrive, how to efficiently fuel them, how to set up an efficient road system with some blueprints as well. So you can check that out. I'll link to that below. Okay, so now we have a nice rubber, plastic and fuel factory, and that means that we can move on to actually finishing phase 3 in our main factory. In order to do that, we're going to need industrial manufacturing, which is going to unlock the manufacturer. That allows up to 4 items going to be put in order to make 1 new item, and we're also going to get 4 new items to create with that along with it. However, before we move on to the manufacturers, there's a few more things we need from the assemblers. So we have these rows of 5 assemblers over here with some space behind that, and we're going to use that for another row of 5 assemblers making automated wiring. There we go. Now bear with me, we're in the home stretch, but it's still going to take a little bit of time to actually finish building those last few items. Moving on from the automated wiring to the rows of 4, we have another row of 4 assemblers making circuit boards. Now actually we need to overclock one of these assemblers to 133% in order to make all the circuit boards that we need. And I really like that circuit boards are green in nature because that gives me an excuse to give these things another color. Which means it's manufacturer time, and the first 2 manufacturers that we're going to be building are dedicated to computer production. Now, as you can see, these things are huge, so make sure you pick a location where you have plenty of space because we're going to be building a lot more of these. Now, dealing with 3 or 4 inputs in a manufacturer can be really challenging actually, because you have all 4 of them very close together. So the way to deal with that without too much clipping is to make sure you have an output like this and then you space them out with splitters accordingly. So you have a ceiling mount basically that you attach. So you kind of do something like this, then you take a splitter and you connect that to the end of the line, and you do that for every single one of these outputs, and then do it at a different distance so you can split them out. Now there will still be some clipping, you might run into belts that you previously placed that you might need to kind of move it out of the way if you want to avoid that clipping, or you can just say F it and deal with it as it is. And as someone pointed out in the comments, it's kind of like spaghetti versus hidden spaghetti, but if you can't see the spaghetti, is it still there? Well, you tell me. Of course, if you want to avoid all spaghetti, what you can do is basically do the same setup as I've done over here, but make it vertical. So make the top line be at the top and then the second line be a little bit lower than that, etc, etc. It's a lot harder to get around in your factory that way, and well, depending on how you handle the belts after that, so you might need to raise and lower belts a lot in your factory as well. It's a lot more work, basically, but it is cleaner if you put in that work. So it's completely up to you whether or not you want to deal with that. It'll take a little while for the factory to actually produce enough resources for your depot to fill up and then continue on to produce it for the rest of your factory, but we have nothing but time in this game, so I wouldn't worry about that too much. Now, although I don't recommend doing this, if you really can't be bothered to wait a little bit for the resources to fill up, you can always buy a couple of stacks from the awesome shop and fill your depot that way, and that way everything else will be going into your factory. Again, I don't recommend it because these things are relatively expensive to buy this way, but still, you can. Anyway, back to our blueprint. Remember that when you're placing a blueprint that includes the actual logistics floor, you actually need to clear out the existing logistics floor and have some pillars that are just slightly below where you want your actual platform to be, so that you can rest your blueprint on top of that. It can be a little bit hard to place these blueprints, but once you have it somewhere near where you want, just press H to lock it in. And then by nudging, you can move it where you want. And this one actually turned out to be perfect the first time around, but sometimes you need to nudge it a little bit that you can place it. And there we go. Now we have an entire manufacturing, including all the logistics below, ready to go. Speaking of which, this one is going to be producing heavy modular frames, and we're going to overclock it to 125% because we need slightly more than one, but I don't want to build an entire manufacturer just for that 0.25% that we need. Now for that manufacturer in specific, you're going to want to unlock the tier 4 belt. And just in case you missed it, the reason for that is because we're overclocking here, we're actually going to need 300 screws per minute, which is more than a tier 3 belt can actually handle. So we're just going to need one tier 4 belt in our factory for this single purpose. Now you can also solve this with some of the alternative recipes, but I'm sticking with the normal ones for the moment. So I hope you really like building manufacturers, because we're going to be building 2.5 more of them. I built 3, as you can see, because I'm underclocking one to 50% to save a little bit of power and a little bit of power shards, because I'm actually running a little bit low on them. Although I can probably make a lot more, because I think I have like a ton of those slugs in my inventory. But anyway, I built 3 just because. You can also build 2 and then overclock one of them to 150%, the same thing. But as you can see, these 3 will be making adaptive control units, and that means we are one step closer to completing phase 3, because now we only need modular engines. To be exact, you're going to need 5 manufacturers making those, and this time there's no over or underclocking, it's just straight up 5 of the manufacturers making that. So there's one in the corner over there, and then there's 4 more to make a total of 5 of them making the modular engines. As you can see, this one actually starts producing quite quickly because we already had all the required resources for that. Because it's relatively low effort things that we have been producing for a very long time. As you can see, the adaptive control units are still not doing anything, but that's mostly because we're still waiting for the heavy modular frame to buffer. And once that is done, this will start producing actually quite quickly, and I think it might actually finish before the modular engines in terms of the 100 versus the 500 we need, but I guess we're going to find out. Now I do want to point out that we're going to get to a point fairly quickly, at least before we reach the end of phase 4, let's put it like that, where we are still producing all of these things, the versatile frameworks, modular engines and the adaptive control units, while we don't really need them. So I would recommend hooking them up to your sink or storing them one way or another, but make sure they're not going to waste. I also want to point out that if you reach this part of the game where you're about to complete phase 3, you're actually further ahead than most people ever get in this game. Just looking at this, you can see why. There's a huge amount of logistics going on, there's a massive amount of production going on, and none of that is trivial. It's doable if you do it step by step and you follow kind of the steps that I showed you, but you still need to connect everything up, still everything needs to actually work. And that is not trivial, so you should be proud of yourself if you got to this point. This is also a good moment to kind of work on your factory. Make it look pretty by adding some edges, maybe some walkways. Make sure your factory isn't actually just floating in the air, but supported by some columns and pillars and things like that. And generally speaking, I would suggest that you leave the sides open a little bit so you don't get all those big boxes all over the place, because that gets boring really fast. Then again, who am I to tell you what is pretty and what is not, so make sure you do whatever you feel like and that makes you feel good about the factory that you're constantly going to be looking at. Last but not least, here is a kind of bird's eye overview of the factory that we've built. So over half of this we actually built in this episode, so that should probably take you a couple of evenings, depending on, of course, how long your evenings are when you play. But we have the copper in the back, we have the wire, we have the copper sheets, and we have the cables over here, and then we are producing things like motors and circuit boards over here as well as the stators. Now, they have all the manufacturers here in the front that we just showed you a minute ago, so I won't go through that once again. But as you can see, it's super organized. It's looking, in terms of the aesthetics, it looks very consistent. And it also doesn't look too boring, I think. I hope. I mean, again, completely subjective, but all in all, I am not too unhappy about how this turned out. I also did build myself a tiny little home base over there. I made that white, don't know why, with a sink, so I can just dump that in here. My previous version is actually still up and running there. But I relocated the temporary station that we had over there with all the storage boxes. I cleaned them out, synced all the stuff in there, and now we have our little workshop over here, which we'll be continuing from in the next episode. Okay, so that was a bit of a monster episode, honestly. There's a huge amount of building in this one, but I hope you found it useful and enjoyable as well. If you're still here, you are definitely awesome. And next time around, we are going to do some really amazing stuff. We're going to take our factory building up to the next level. Really excited to show you that as well. So I definitely hope to catch you in the next one.